name is Andy Markovits, and I teach in the Department of Political Science at this university, Department of Germanic Languages and Literatures. And I guess one of the reasons that I was asked to introduce Andrei Codrescu is because my official name is also Andrei. Having left Romania when I was 9 years old, in fact, having been born in the town that really started the Romanian Revolution in Timișoara, the only thing that we could take with us was my birth certificate. So that's what it says, Andrei, on it. And I guess this is one of the few things that definitely ties me to the other Andrei, whom I'm really honored to have been asked to introduce. Born in Sibiu, Romania in 1946, Sibiu, of course, known to some of you maybe as Hermannstadt, and of course also known, and it was written up in the New York Times this past Sunday, for a mayor by the name of Klaus Iohannis, who very well might become, in fact, Romania's next prime minister. Andrei Codrescu published his first poems in the Romanian language under the pen name of Andrei Steu. In 1965, he left the country to escape from the communist regime. After time in Italy, many people actually who left Romania went to Italy. I have other friends who did this as well, and then emigrated to the United States in 1966, where he settled in Detroit, where he became a regular at the John Sinclair's Artists and Writers Workshop. A year later, he moved to New York, where he became part of the literary scene on the Lower East Side, where he met folks like Allen Ginsberg, Ted Berrigan, and Anne Waldman, and published his first poems in English. In 1970, his poetry book, Licenses to Carry a Gun, won the Big Table Award. He moved to the West Coast, to San Francisco in 1970, and lived on the West Coast for 7 years. I assume, by the way, doesn't say here, but knowing people like Lawrence Ferlinghetti and City Light Bookstore, I'm sure. He also then moved to Baltimore, where he taught at Johns Hopkins University, lived in New Orleans and in Baton Rouge, publishing books virtually every year, and actively participating in literary life by writing poetry, stories, essays, and reviews for many publications, including the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Los Angeles Times, Harper's, and Paris Review. He has been a regular commentator, and that's how I know him, of course, on NPR's many programs, including, of course, All Things Considered since 1983, and he won the 1995 Peabody Award for the film Road Scholar, which he just informed me that it played in the State Theater for quite a while, and he was in Ann Arbor for that event as well. This movie, of course, is an American road saga that he wrote and in which he starred. And he was a two-time winner of the Pushcart Prize. Andrei Codrescu has been called one of our most magical writers by the New York Times. In 1989, Codrescu covered, of course, the Romanian Revolution in NPR and also on ABC's Nightline, where I was riveted to his analyses. And again, it's such an honor for me to meet him today personally. He later actually returned to his Romanian roots and wrote a book of poetry and book-length interviews conducted by the theologian Robert Lazu. It's called Miracle and Catastrophe. In 2005, he was awarded the prestigious International Ovidius Prize. Previous winners include such folks as Maria Vargas Llosa, Amos Oz, and Orhan Pamuk. He's the editor and founder of the online journal Exquisite Corpse, and he has recently told me that he's now moved to the borderlands between Arkansas and Louisiana, where he is building a huge library and he's enjoying the wonderful wilderness there. He's writing books, among other things, also for Princeton University Press, one of the few things other than our first names that we share. And I think without further ado, I'd like to have Andrei Codrescu come here. Bine ați venit in Ann Arbor, domnul Codrescu.
Mulțumesc. Thank you very much, Andrei, patron saint of Romania. December 1st, our saintly birthday. Of course, Saint Andrew was supposed to have converted all those heathens by the Danube to Christianity. But since I'm Jewish, I really don't care.
Me too.
But it's a good name to have. My mother always said, well, she named me Andrei because the Russians are coming. And she thought that if she gave her baby a Russian name, then the Russians would leave us alone. And they did indeed. And she said they were quite nice gentlemen. They danced. And they were, they were not the brutal horrors that everyone expected them to be. Well, I was born there, but I left later than Andrei. I left when I was 19 years old, and I'm here to tell you a story, really, which is known, but I hope to make it interesting again, about events at the end of toward the end of the 20th century. That's partly what my job is, and I don't want to tell you anything you know. I know there are people here in this audience actually who have some real questions about those days, and who are either there and have questions about it, which I can't answer. And I'm sure that they will ask them in the question and answer period. Or they simply won't believe what I'm telling them, which is fine too. I mean, in December of 1989, in the 20th century, which is quite some time ago actually, now a number of things occurred. I mean, 1989 through really 2001, mysterious events took place in Europe. And they had different names. As historians who are writing the stories of what happened, they named them differently. And I'm really saying 1989 to 2005 because I'm counting from January 12, 1989, when the East German legislature voted for the first time against the monopoly of the Communist Party, to the end of the wars in Yugoslavia, and the Dayton Agreements the Dayton Agreements in 1995, and the end of the wars in Yugoslavia in 2001. So I'm covering a period here, these mysteries from 1989 to 2001. Now, the reason I decided that this period is more important to think of it as a continuum than it is to just talk about the year 1989, which had most things happen, is because almost everything that happened after 1989 into the 21st century, in fact, was connected to that first vote in Germany. In 1989, beginning in January, there were changes in all of the Eastern European countries that are being reported very closely in the Western press. Clearly something was going on, in fact, one thing after another. And of all the changes in Germany, in Czechoslovakia, in Poland, the only country that seemed to stand absolutely still was Romania. Nothing was going on in Romania, and everyone was wondering, where are the Romanian people in this series of events in Eastern Europe that were by then beginning to acquire names. The fall of communism, the collapse of the Soviet Empire, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and so on. And the analysts are already at work trying to explain some of this very fresh history. Some of them crediting Ronald Reagan with bankrupting the Soviet Union through the arms race, and those of us who knew better really crediting Lou Reed and Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan with the fact that a young generation in Eastern Europe, in fact, knew very well that the system was rotting from within and it would soon collapse, and that we had more in common with our generation in the West than we did with the older managers of both East and West governments. So what were these mysteries? I mean, all these names are metaphors, the shredding of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, the fall of the Berlin Wall wasn't exactly a metaphor, since everybody got little pieces of it that they took home for souvenirs. Actually, I had an interesting moment in South Dakota on a panel talking to a general shortly after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we were both displaying little pieces of the wall that we had in front of us. General was actually trying to defend the untenable position of still having nuclear silos in North Dakota, which, the Cold War was seemingly over, and he said, but we still need these. And I said, for what? And he said, for the drug wars that are coming. Yeah, we need to sort of nuke these guys in Peru, who are making cocaine, but yeah. I mean, there were strange things, but there were pieces of the Berlin Wall. So yeah, I mean, physically, yes, this was a fact, but it was still metaphorical. A metaphor that, gained traction since, Reagan, said, Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And of course, since Kennedy made his famous speech, actually. So, this thing was real, but I mean, it was also highly metaphorical. Well, as Eastern Europe started to drift away from the center, from Moscow, nothing is happening in Romania until things started to happen in Romania. And so we had, this sort of these countries detaching from the center in a peaceful, more or less peaceful way. We had the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. It happened without any murder, any violence, any suppression. And then Romania exploded. The Romanian events began in Timișoara, your birthplace, in 17th or 18th of December, with demonstrations, with originally a number of people going to the house of Reverend Laszlo Tökes to make a human chain to prevent him from being taken from his parish and sent into the provinces. There's nothing more horrific in Romania than being sent to the provinces. There's nothing more horrific in any province than being sent to the provinces. I mean, this is a very provincial place, at the edge of the former Turkish Empire, but then if you're threatened with being sent to the provinces, things get serious. Well, the center is what it is. Well, this is a story, so I'm just telling a story. But then, indeed, people did come into the streets to seemingly defend or prevent the exile of Reverend Tökes to the provinces. But then the crowds grew bigger, and they started chanting slogans against the dictator, which was unheard of in Romania. And very quickly, things evolved into mass demonstrations, into civil unrest in other parts of the country, culminating in Bucharest at a certain point. And now I'm going to cite a few of my reporting bits from the period, because they have the hot feeling of the days still in them, and then I'm going to critique them and open them for discussion as well. The Antichrist died on Christmas Day. With these words, the Romanian radio let the nation and the world know that Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, the rulers of Romania for a quarter of a century, had been put to death by a firing squad after a summary trial held by a military court. Okay, this is Christmas 1989, big year in Europe. On television, Romanians saw two crumpled bodies that are fallen away from each other on the frozen ground in a cement courtyard. It's a very dingy place. There were these two corpses that filled the living rooms of billions of people all over the world via satellite. At this point, I was in New Orleans, thousands of miles away, and I watched, of course, fascinated and repelled, and I'm sure that many of you remember. And many of you remember also the moment preceding this execution in this dingy courtyard with the two corpses of the old people. We remember Ceausescu on television less than a week before, standing on the balcony and making a speech with his arms extended and speaking to a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people who were trucked in from factories and so on, as it was always done in the old communist demonstrations and speeches of the leader. So there was a crowd of hundreds of thousands of people, and all of a sudden these hundreds of thousands of people started booing him. It had never happened. And when this happened, his arms are just frozen. He just stayed there. It was a sort of gesture, and with his mouth open, and he turned white, and then he was gone, forever. And at that moment, he looked already dead. I mean, there was a certain gift that communist leaders had of looking dead, just moments before they were actually dead. Brezhnev famously stood on the podium of the last meeting of the last May Day parade, looking dead, and probably was dead. He was just being held up, So, there's a whole cult of this business. Lenin was embalmed for a very long time, and people still. They tried to move him into the wall like Stalin, but they keep him in the mausoleum. And now it's open from, 10 to 3. I'm not sure, but there's always a long line to watch, to look at Lenin. And he looks very lifelike in his wax mausoleum, although his brain is in the laboratory, where it's been dissected into thousands and thousands of slices by Soviet scientists who wanted to know how such a great man could exist. I'm opening lots of parentheses here, and I'll keep doing it. So, the courtyard where the Ceausescus were lying dead, and which we saw on television, is very bleak and undistinguished. It was this cement enclosure, and every year, the Ceausescus had demanded larger and larger spaces for themselves, and the great hall of their palace, which was built just before the end, was built really for the purpose of framing Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu in proper surroundings. So they practically bankrupted the country creating this palace, really a private residence that was very grandiose, and it was built on a scale probably unknown since Albert Speer built Hitler's 1,000-year Reich, which lasted, 3 years. Grandiosity has an instant payoff. So you look at this picture, and those of you who saw it, I'm sure, looked at it, and you had various reactions to it. But the faces on those crumpled bodies, even if after they were shot, looked disbelieving. And the look on their faces was, we're not really dead, because you can't possibly be dead in such a small and dirty place after we were so gloriously in power. And, Ceausescu had been one of the last of his kind because, and there probably is in Korea now, the Kim Il-sung, Kim Jong-il, I don't remember his daddy. It's probably aiming for the same kind of monumentality, but anyone watching actually these events taking place in December of 1989 had to shake a kind of a disbelieving head at the speed of the events, because time was suddenly compressed, and history was going by so fast, few people could keep track of it. Actually, a New York Times reporter writing at the time, one of the smartest observers of the scene, said, someone pushed the fast-forward button on history. And it's true that between that Christmas Day in 1989, when the dictator was lying dead, just 2 weeks before, he'd been reelected by enthusiastic crowds, and acclaimed leader of the party and of Romania, and really only a month had elapsed between his glorious, ascent and his death. And even most of the months sort of appeared to be unremarkable, because it was only the beginning in the second half of December that history started to move in Romania. But 45 years of communism were undone in 8 days. So these were, the 8 Romanian days that shook the world, to, quote John Reed a bit, about the 10 days of, that shook the world in Russia, which is another story altogether, but maybe not. But these 8 Romanian days that shook the world began in Timișoara, and on December 15th, actually, I have the date here because now I'm looking at the text. So, but the upheavals in the rest of the Soviet-dominated Europe, had aroused a great deal of hope. And the reason why Timișoara became a center of the rebellion was that they were able to hear Yugoslav and Hungarian radio and get Yugoslav television, and in addition, of course, Radio Free Europe, which did a really terrific job of reporting for many years, fairly straight what was going on, was keeping everybody pretty much informed about what was going on. But the way the official narrative has it, and I'm getting to the unofficial one that I'm really trying to tell you, is that when the police, the militia arrived on the scene of the demonstrations in Timișoara, a single cry was down Ceausescu, and then from that point on, the revolt began, and the people started crying down at the dictator, and it all erupted. But then on Sunday following, on December 17, the crowds in Timișoara moved into the central squares. There was no more room in front of the Turkish house, and suddenly there was a spring-like temperature. Now, being as cold as it is here, this is a good moment to note this, because it was December 17th, and it was 22 degrees Celsius, which is actually really incredibly warm. Great time for a revolt, I mean, if you're going to have a revolution, make sure it's on a nice warm day. And at 5 o'clock that afternoon, a helicopter appeared over the crowds that were gathered all over Timișoara, and the crowds are all shouting different slogans that were invented in the moment. And Romanian being a very euphonious language, it's very easy actually to sing. Nobody leaves until the dictatorship gives, and people are raising their fists to the sky and so on. And really it looked like absolutely there was no resistance. In the early evening of December 17, a small armored carrier caught on fire. At the same time, a newsstand blew up, and there was sound of breaking glass, and in store windows were being smashed, and several small fires broke out on the side streets. And the demonstrators, who had been quite peaceful until then, were really baffled by this sort of little incidents of violence, so the mood of the demonstration, which was really consistently nonviolent and even festive, changed. And the demonstrators started shouting, "We are nonviolent." They were following the Prague example of the demonstrators in Prague and the Velvet Revolution. "We are nonviolent, peace." And people started speaking behind banners, and microphones appeared, and the army started making lines of shields and guns, and the people kept calling to them and saying, "You're our brothers, come join us. You're obviously not, you're on our side, so we're all Romanians." And you could see on television, I'm still talking about TV now, you could see this sort of anguish on the faces of these young boys who were just, holding guns and looking at demonstrators. Well, they didn't have a whole lot of time to think, because a half hour later, in the square, they were ordered to open fire. And not all of them did. Some of them refused, but for the most part, they obeyed their orders, and some of the demonstrators were shouting blanks, blanks. I mean, this is really not happening. But then there was a tracer rocket, and people started falling, and the demonstrators started carrying out the wounded. And what had begun as this kind of festival of the end of the year 1989, which saw one red domino fall after another peacefully, became deadly. And some people held their children up so the soldiers could see them and say, "Don't shoot our children," but the fusillade continued, and in fact they kept firing into the crowd. And people were screaming and tried to run, of course, and they were tripping over the bodies in front of them, and some of them started singing an old forbidden Romanian song, "Rise Romanians," you know, to etc., you know, sort of national songs. At the same time, you know, the sloganeering of the crowd was becoming more inventive, and they were shouting "murderers" and "down with Ceausescu, liberty," etc. And there was blood all over the pavements, and people were slipping in the blood. It's the stuff we saw, actually. So the initial reports from Timișoara of what was going on were filed by Yugoslav, Hungarian, and Soviet reporters who were the first on the scene. The Hungarian radio broadcast a report from a young journalist surrounded by the sound of broken glass and machine gun fire. And there were 5,000 to 10,000 people killed, according to the Tangier correspondent who witnessed the events in the square. This was the official Yugoslav news agency. A Hungarian report filed from near the cathedral put the figure at 7,500 dead people. So the spring day, quote spring of Sunday, the 17th, ended with a very unusual meteorological phenomenon. A violent storm with heavy rain and thunder and lightning. So the blood was washed from the streets by the storm. On Monday, the sky cleared, the sun was shining. In front of the cathedral, people came back. And the woman was standing on the highest step of the cathedral and waving the tricolor flag, and everybody was singing, "Arise, Romanians, arise." And there were children lighting candles for the dead. In the afternoon, the tanks reappeared. And this time, when the order came to fire, many soldiers, in fact, didn't fire. They came to the side of the demonstrators, and they gave up their weapons. At the same time, the newscasts from Timișoara, from Hungary and Yugoslavia, and the Romanian language stations from abroad, kept the people, even the people in Timișoara, apprised of their own situation. They were telling the people what was happening in their own city. And so they were told that flatbed trucks carted off the bodies to quickly dug shallow mass graves on the outside of town. A Polish reporter who reached Budapest from Timișoara on Wednesday, December 20th, said that he saw them tossing bodies into the river. The hospitals were supposedly full of the dead and the wounded, many of them lying in the halls with open wounds, bleeding to death, and there wasn't enough medicine to treat them. And there was a worldwide gasp of terror. Some of you may well remember this, but there was this international wave of protests against the massacre of unarmed protesters, which resembled actually the earlier shock of the massacre at Tiananmen Square, which actually, took place earlier. And but most of the reporting came from Romania's neighbor states, from the Warsaw Pact states. And at that point, trucks full of relief supplies, medicine, and urgently needed bloods were breaching the Romanian borders, which are still closed, with the help of willing border guards. And so young solidarity workers from Poland, from Polish cities, drove in with trucks under the cover of night and were supposedly fired on. Some of them didn't make it. Official gestures from Europe were mostly symbolic, but ambassadors were recalled. You have to remember, at this point, Ceausescu is still in power, hasn't been killed yet. We're still in Timișoara in December of 17. The Queen of England actually took back the knighthood that she gave Ceausescu a little earlier. I don't know how you do that, actually. Well, you have to kneel to get it, but how do you know? Norway took back its greatest honor, which was the Grand Cross of St. Olaf, which it gave to both of the Ceausescus. So the same Ceausescus that were now mightily condemned by the world, had been the darlings of the West in the not so distant past, and had enjoyed the admiration of American and British leaders for reasons, of course, of political expediency. In the early 70s, Ceausescu helped bring about the meeting of Richard Nixon and Mao Zedong, a diplomatic move that earned him 2 presidential visits from Presidents Nixon and Ford to Bucharest. So in the face of this international scandal of all this news coming out of Romania going on about Ceausescu, the country's president and supreme leader, this is going on in Timișoara, right, 17th or 18th of December. He decides that he's going to make an official state visit to Iran to pay his respects to the Ayatollah Khomeini. Okay, so with the country on the verge of exploding, Ceausescu leaves for Iran on a state visit. So, it's possible that he was so out of touch that he actually thought that, he didn't really realize the magnitude of the disaster that was going on, and he was just going to do what he did. So, it's possible. Anyway, he returned. He was furious. He returned from his state visit to Iran, and he called an emergency meeting of the party, of the Communist Party Central Committee, to discuss the events in Timișoara. He came back to Bucharest. So he was absolutely outraged, and he berated the generals of the army and of the Securitate forces for not using live ammunition against the demonstrators. Well, either apparently he hadn't heard yet the reports of the body counts of the army firing on the demonstrators in Timișoara, or he didn't believe them. But he insisted when he called in the generals that they had been firing blanks in Timișoara. They actually hadn't killed anybody. So he threatened all his underlings with the firing squad, and shooting blanks, he said, it was like a rain shower. This is a quote. And his wife, Elena, who was the other most powerful person in the country, interjected that the demonstrators should never again be allowed to, quote, see the light of the day. Okay, well, curiously enough, while calling for live ammo, Ceausescu did not order the demonstrators to be killed. This is really an important point, because he didn't. He said, well, I can't believe they didn't use live ammo, but he didn't tell them to use live ammo. So real bullets, should be used, okay, but first warning shots had to be fired. And this is also another quote. He said, demonstrators ought to be shot in the legs first. This was the order. Well, if no one had been killed, one might understand this order, right? If no one had been killed in Timișoara, then, maybe, okay, we should shoot them in the legs first. But what was the point of it if the civil war was already raging, which is how it was being reported in the whole world? So, what seems like a nearly dated version of history, Ceausescu went on as if the Timișoara revolt was still a matter of a bunch of demonstrators defending a priest. So he absolutely did not know what was going on. At the same time, he accused his chief generals of treason. And these were the defense minister Vasile Milea and the Securitate chief Iulian Vlad. And he accused them of being lax in their duties because they had not suppressed the revolt in Timișoara. So the generals were present, Milea and Vlad, also seemed to share this belief of Ceausescu's that nothing had been done to put down the revolt in Timișoara. So they attempted to argue with their commander-in-chief about the use of fire. And so this only added fuel to the fire because the Ceausescu's were, terribly enraged. And Ceausescu apparently screamed. Again, I'm putting quotations around these because they were reported in the press, and, the quotes are from the reports, but then I'm putting double quotes which belong to me. So as Nabokov once said, putting double quotes around single quotes is a symptom of insanity, but putting double quotes around double quotes is a symptom of double insanity. I said that. So it's a very surreal discussion. So Ceausescu says, a few hooligans want to destroy socialism and you make a child's play for them. You do not quiet an enemy by talking with him like a priest, but by burning him. You are cowards, Elena Ceausescu told the generals. So the 25 Central Committee members who were present at this secret meeting, secret then, agreed with the Ceausescu without the slightest hint of dissent. The reaction of the parliament president, Manea Mănescu, was typical of all of them. He said, I agree with you and with all your measures, which, is really commie speak for many years. Hours later, it was announced that the defense minister, Milea, had committed suicide. He could not bring himself to order troops to fire on the demonstrators in Timișoara. So what happened to General Milea? And according to his bodyguard, following the meeting, the defense minister walked into the small office adjoining the hall where the meeting was and shot himself in the head. He told his bodyguard to explain to his wife and children that he was unable to fulfill Ceausescu's criminal orders. So he ended up being a hero, actually. Now there are a lot of boulevards in Romania named Boulevard General Milea. So he borrowed the officer's pistol, actually. He didn't use his own. He shot himself in the head with his bodyguard's gun. And Milea's suicide was announced hours later by the Romanian press, by Ceausescu a few hours later. And of course, everybody thought that it was a murder, that he'd been shot. One of the big guys at the meeting, Emil Bobu, who testified at his own trial, he testified that Milea was assassinated at Ceausescu's orders. So this had to probably be the right explanation, because General Milea, of course, knew, if it was true, that the army had already fired on demonstrators in Timișoara. So why would he commit suicide for refusing orders to do something he already did? It's one of those increasing paradoxes. It's going to get weirder. So would anyone kill himself to sort of maintain a fiction? And you realize that as you go into this history, that actually people kill themselves quite often to maintain a fiction. So Defense Minister Milea's death, according to the provisional government, was instrumental in the army's later decision on December 22nd to abandon Ceausescu and to defend the revolution. So the army, however, on orders from people no one has yet been able to identify, actually, to this time, did fire on demonstrators in Timișoara and killed hundreds, and on demonstrators elsewhere on December 22nd. But to this day in Romania, the army will deny that it fired on anybody. So there is a heroic version of the death of this general, of General Milea, that led to his instant glorification after 1989, after the revolution. It's a major highway in my hometown, actually. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, December 18th, 20th, were working days in Timișoara, but one after another, all the factories went on strike. So the electric company, the Timișoara Electric, went on strike, was followed by all the major industries, and the workers all began shouting, Ceausescu's guilty, give us back our dead, death, death, death. And then the mood of the crowd really changed to one of grimness, where it had been one of, even with people being fired on, one of celebration. But the revolution had now been going on for 3 days in Timișoara, and the loss of lives was reportedly staggering, and no one gave up. So on this, on this day, on the 20th, the soldiers didn't just throw away their weapons. They came to the side of the people armed, and some of them brought their tanks. So now we're seeing a different picture on television, a totally different picture of soldiers coming to the side of the people. It's an extraordinary wave of joy that goes through the crowd on December 20th, and the shout that was heard for the first time that day just shook the whole country, which was, the army is with us. Okay, so it looked like that. The soldiers now joined the people en masse, and they turned their guns against some other invisible force, which nobody could see or know. And this was assumed generally to be Securitate, which was a special army that had been trained by the Ceausescus to defend them to the death, and they were units of the Romanian secret police that were especially trained for this. So, but the tide had turned, and some people thought, or some reports were saying that this was going to be the beginning of a bloody civil war, because there was no way that communism was going to give up so easily in the last staunch dictatorship in Eastern Europe. And Securitate resistance was mounting, and invisible armies were attempting to hold to the very end, and Securitate was said to be better equipped than the army, which Ceausescu had purposefully neglected. There are parallels to this in other places, but I won't get into it now. But Securitate had also been trained by foreign terrorists. This was another one of the common, reports of the time. The Securitate had been trained by foreign terrorists, and they had ultra-modern weapons, and it was going to be a long struggle, and so on. But the news from Timișoara then electrified the citizens in Bucharest, and the capital had been waiting for something to set off their own revolt. Students at the university had been teaching themselves self-defense techniques, which they learned from the students in Prague. Then wall posters appeared calling for solidarity with the people of Timișoara, and then Romanian radio, television, and newspapers in Bucharest reported Ceausescu's comments that, quote, "a gang of bandits, Hungarian spies, and traitors are creating civil disturbances in Timișoara, and that their demands for reform will be granted, quote, when the poplars have pears." This is a Romanian proverb, actually, when the poplars have pears. So next day, the big pears that were cut out of paper hung from all the trees in Bucharest, So at that point, all the telephonic links to Timișoara were cut. And the Romanian people stayed informed, however, through Radio Free Europe, through the Voice of America, through the BBC about these extraordinary events going on in Timișoara. Soviet and Bulgarian TV, which were seen in the capital, relayed all the Yugoslav and the Hungarian reports. And young men from all over Romania took trains to Timișoara to form patriotic guards to defend the city. And workers occupied the factories, and black committees kept civic order and organized defense units. And by December 21st, Timișoara was a revolutionary commune. So it was said at that point that special army and Securitate units loyal to the dictator, many of them mercenary Arabs, by the way, Palestinians make an appearance in this story now at this point. They were being flown in from secret camps in the Carpathian Mountains, and there were actually training camps for Palestinian terrorists in the Carpathians. Another story, but whether they were flown in or not is something else. So the surrounded city of Timișoara awaited its fate, but at this point there was only sporadic gunfire on the side streets, and orders to attack, if they were given, were not being obeyed, or they were being countermanded at some other levels. And following the suicide or the murder of General Milea, Ceausescu called a huge meeting in Republic Square, and it was supposed to go like it always did with workers trucked in. And now we're going back to the beginning of my story. This meeting happened, and instead of people listening quietly, they began to shout, "Give us back our dead," down with the dictatorship. So this was the dictator on the balcony making this speech, the same place where he'd made hour-long speeches for endless years before adoring crowds and children waving and banners and so on. I mean, it's hard to really get the time frame here because it's not very long before the adoring crowds were in there. And this is something I'm trying to, tell you about time. When Ceausescu was re-elected president, his son, Nicu Ceausescu, who was a small regional dictator in my hometown of Sibiu, had extolled the virtues of his father as the brilliant genius of the people and the great master of the Carpathians and so on. This rally was not expected to be any different, and it was being carried live by radio and television, but, then it was drowned out by the crowd, by the jeering crowd. And the television then replaced the jeering of the crowd with canned applause and with patriotic music. I mean, they just didn't know what to do. And it was Ceausescu's last live appearance on the airwaves. He just saturated forever. And then the next time we saw him on television, he was lying with his wife in a dirty cement courtyard, shot. So moments after Ceausescu left the balcony, taken off by a helicopter, the crowds in the streets surged into the Central Committee building, and seconds later, thousands of Ceausescu's books were thrown off the balcony into the streets, and people set fire to them, and they went up in flames, and everyone was just dancing for joy around the buildings and thinking the revolution had succeeded, and it was the end of that. And people, the soldiers were descending from the tanks, and people went up to the soldiers and were kissing them, and the tricolor had the socialist anthem removed from the middle, and there was a hole in it, and the flag in the hole appeared. And everything looked very revolutionary, terrifically revolutionary. Two poets announced the end of the dictatorship. It was Mircea Dinescu and Ana Blandiana, who were both recognized by the demonstrators and carried on shoulders to the television and to the radio station. And it's Ana Blandiana's famous words that I quoted at the beginning, which is the Antichrist died on Christmas Day. So she announced both the end of the revolution the success of the revolution and the end of the Ceausescu's. So inside the Central Committee building, there was apparent chaos, and groups of demonstrators and government officials found themselves side by side, and discussion groups and civic committees were formed. And at this point, it is said that the leaders of the National Salvation Front appeared spontaneously and began to address the crowds. And among them were Ion Iliescu, Petre Roman, Dumitru Mazilu, Silviu Brucan. And after addressing the crowds, they were taken by armored army vehicles to the television station to present their success of the revolution to the country. And for 6 delirious hours, and I mean they really were delirious, all kinds of people made anti-communist and anti-Ceausescu speeches from the balcony of the Central Committee. And there were just a lot of them were actually ordinary people, and they were just, everybody got to speak. And after this apparent success, during the night of December 21st, after the Ceausescu had taken off from the balcony and had gone somewhere else, nobody knew they had been shot yet, the unarmed crowds in the streets had swarmed, they had just swollen to millions. All of a sudden, they came under fire. And there was heavy fire, just firing directly into the crowds, and heavy artillery fire. The library of the University of Bucharest went up in flames at that point. Scores of other buildings were shelled, and the Battle of Bucharest raged for 3 days. And the crowd surged on the government buildings, which had civil defense armories, and they received weapons from sympathetic people inside. All the newspapers, the communist newspapers, reappeared to change names. Scânteia, the main newspaper, became Adevărul, the truth. The Spark became the Truth. Lovely papers, actually. I have a collection of them. It's great. Put them on. But the headlines were just about this big. There was just moments before all these things like citizens, members of the Patriotic Guards, anyone who can use a weapon to arms, defeat the enemies and traitors of the country, killers and vandals. The same newspaper announced the formation of the National Salvation Front, which was a broad coalition of dissidents that was ranging from disgruntled communists like Ion Iliescu, who was not yet officially the president of the front, and there were urgent proclamations issued on television and so on. It is an amazing atmosphere. Actually, to experience a revolution is a wonderful thing. I wish you would all do that at least once. Some of you probably have. 1967 wasn't bad in Detroit, but it wasn't quite this. But all of these historic scenes of the revolution in Romania were shown live on television. And this was really something new because there were studios, there were cameras both inside the Central Committee headquarters and in the television studios themselves. And some of the battles on the streets are being telecast simultaneously in dramatic bulletins. And there were all sorts of stories. There were terrorists hidden in air vents inside the television station that appeared suddenly and killed reporters. I mean, nobody actually saw that, but they were told. There was gunfire heard in every part of the television building. Army units that came to the side of the revolution were defending the station that was now ringed by several tanks. And throughout this fighting, the television never went off the air. Okay, nobody interrupted electricity to the TV station. So the most dramatic moment in recent Romanian history took place before everyone's eyes. And there were images of street-to-street combat, interspersed with all kinds of declarations of freedom, of newly emerging revolutionary leaders, and some of the greatest decisions of the front were made on television. The television station also served as a military operations center because there was supposedly a resistance still going on. And so working around the clock to sort of monitor and direct the military situation, there were two generals. One was an army general named Ștefan Gușa, and the other was, also in uniform, was the Securitate General, General Iulian Vlad, who also was on television working, giving orders to his troops. They were both on the telephone. So at a given moment, the tide of the battle seemed to run back and forth, at least, according to the reports. Sometimes it looked as if Securitate was gaining the upper hand in some of the towns. At other times, it looked like the army was actually winning. On December 23rd, it was announced that the morale was very low among the members of the National Salvation Front, and there was an urgent meeting to discuss the situation, and the three leaders of the National Salvation Front and 10 generals, including Gușa and Vlad, were called into this meeting at the urging of Silviu Brucan, an old party hand. General Vlad was placed under arrest because they decided that he was actually listening to the other general and telling his troops what to do, because he just heard the other guy say that. Drama, how better can it get? Vlad has been relaying this report. So the situation on the streets was still very chaotic, and nobody quite knew what was happening. Now I'm opening here another parenthesis because Silviu Brucan, who was sort of the eminence grise of this entire drama, had been a high-ranking member of the Communist Party before Ceausescu, and he'd been an ambassador to Washington and a good friend of the Soviets, and probably both a KGB and a CIA agent. Now I met Brucan in New Orleans after this book was written. His nephew was teaching. He was a philosophy professor at Tulane, and we had dinner, and I said, Brucan, now can you read this book and just tell me what I got wrong? And just write down what I got wrong about your participation in all these meetings. And he said, well, I will not write anything down, but you come over and we will talk about it. And if you ask me the right questions, I'll just answer them. So I went to, he was staying at the house of some professor on sabbatical, so he had a bottle of scotch, and then he cooked some very hard eggs. I mean, he'd been a communist in the days when it was illegal to be a communist. He'd come really from the underground, so, his eggs were, sort of illegal late-night eggs. Is what you cook when you get serious, but you need some protein, but it's not above the food. And we drank a bottle of whiskey, and he said, well, no notes, no paper, no notes, no tape recorder. So I did ask him, actually, about a lot of the details of these that I'm describing to you, and he did tell me a lot about the decision to actually execute Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, how that happened, and Now, let me just close that little parenthesis a little bit, and if I don't reopen it, remind me, because this is important, because what happened is this, and I'm not going to read it, I'll just tell you the story. What happened is that a helicopter took the Ceausescus off the balcony while the crowd was jeering them, and took to fly them supposedly to some safe place or to a ship waiting on the Black Sea to take them off and take them to Iraq or to Syria, I'm not sure. And the helicopter pilots got a telephone call that was asked, in fact, do you have anybody on board? And he said yes, and then the helicopter came down on the national highway, and unceremoniously these people who had led the country for the better part of a quarter of a century were just shoved out and left to their own devices, and they started hitchhiking. And a lot of people didn't stop. Finally, a guy stopped. I have to read you this actually because it's just too amazing to believe. Actually, yeah, this guy stopped, and he had a Dacia, which was a very shitty Romanian car that was made in those days, and the driver's name was Dr. Nicolae Deca. This is all a matter of record. So in his rearview mirror, he could, as he was driving after he picked him up, he could see that these are the country's most powerful people that are sort of huddling in the back seat. And the dictator, Nicolae Ceausescu, said, "Do you know what's going on?" to the driver. And Deca said, "No, I've been on duty at the hospital." He lied, of course. There's no way anyone would not know what's going on. And so Ceausescu said, and again, this is a quote, later, he said, "There has been a coup. Are you willing to come with us to help organize the resistance?" And the doctor says, "I can't. I have a family, 2 children. I'm 59 years old. I'm old. I'm sick. And I don't know how to fight. Besides, I'm not a member of the party." Courage, huh? So Dr. Deca was later interviewed at some extent. He said he felt this terrible fear, and he also had this feeling that he should scream something awful to the dictator, like the fact that both his brother and his sister were in the United States and had emigrated. But anyway, so at some point, he runs out of gas. And he stops in this little town, and he leans out the car to the driver and says to someone else, do you have any gas? To some, who's this guy? Nicolae Petrișor, who had a bicycle shop. So he stops in front of the bicycle shop. He says, "Do you have any gas?" And so this guy is only happy to oblige. And so he's siphoning gas from his car into the canister of this. And then he looks inside the car and he says, "It's Ceausescu." So he calls to his wife, he says, "Viorica," who appears in the doorway, and sort of claps her hand over her mouth. Great gesture. Says, "It's true. I mean, the Ceausescus." So the doctor starts the car, and Petrișor is shaking with terror, even as he takes the siphon can out. And Elena Ceausescu says, "What's the matter with you? Are you drunk?" And Petrișor says, "No, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist." Okay, you have to know a little bit of the history that the Seventh-day Adventists had indeed been persecuted and, jailed during the regime. So this was, somewhat of, but so had Buddhists and transcendental meditators and a whole bunch of other people, So Elena, they get the gas and says, "Don't worry, keep on driving. We won't kill you." So he drives to the center of the city of Târgoviște, which incidentally is also the sort of place of Dracula, And there are now versions of the story. Now the story begins to diverge. One is that the doctor drove to a factory where he knew the night watchman who might be willing to hide the couple But instead he went to the factory club where workers on break were watching television, and in the very moment that he came in, Romanian television was announcing that the Ceausescus had been captured. And he screams, "I have them in the car." And of course, no one believed him. I mean, so they're watching this on TV, so, how are they going to believe this, So at long last, of his hysterical behavior convinced them that this may be the case, and at this point, soldiers appeared from somewhere, and they took the couple away, and they were driven to an army base and made to climb inside the tank. And on the way to their makeshift prison, apparently, Elena Ceausescu offered the driver of the tank $1 million to help them escape, and the soldiers refused and proudly told the press later that he refused because he felt like a patriot, and she was talking real dollars. So, were these people who sort of demanded blind obedience and had armies their, beck and call moments before, people who ruled a country with an iron fist for, over a quarter of a century, so no one would hide them. No one would come to the rescue. What happened to all those Securitate forces that were supposedly shooting people for them? There was also talk of a Praetorian Guard that were orphan children raised by the Ceausescu to be faithful unto the death, and they didn't seem to be anywhere. They were the same people who were supposedly trained by the PLO to be super fighters. So, what happened to the huge network of spies that Romania had? 1 in every 4 people is supposed to be a spy. Curiously enough, so inside the army base, there is an improvised trial that takes place, and it's a court-martial, and it's shown on Romanian television, and this is what everybody saw. This is what you saw on CNN. This is what everybody saw in Romania. It's a truncated version that was later supplemented by a larger tape, and it's a court-martial, and before the trial, it's an extraordinary exhibit, actually. A doctor takes the dictator's blood pressure and says 60, 70. And then he says, "Can you tell me about your state of health?" And Ceausescu doesn't answer. The doctor then next asks Elena Ceausescu, "Have you been ill? Do you need any medicines?" And she says, "I don't need anything." So standing behind what looks like a school desk, the couple faced the prosecutors, who are invisible in that first version of the tape. In the unedited version, they are visible, actually. They were seen. But then they begin reciting a list of charges that they have improvised quite quickly, and one of them is a charge of genocide, to which the dictator sort of responds with derision. I mean, what genocide? He says, "This is nothing but a coup d'etat." He's clearly contemptuous of this tribunal whose authority he doesn't recognize. And he says, "A coup d'etat organized by a foreign power," he says very pointedly. And no one asks him what foreign power. And he's asked again by an anonymous voice, "Who gave the genocidal order in Timișoara?" Silence. "Who ordered shooting the people in Bucharest? Who are the fanatics who keep shooting?" Ceausescu. "I refuse to answer. Nobody shot anyone in the palace square. No one was killed." The prosecution continues. "Today, there are 64,000 victims in our cities. You reduced our people to misery. There are great scholars who are leaving the country to escape from you." They're all at the University of Michigan now. "Who are the foreign mercenaries who are shooting? Who asked them to come?" Elena says, "It's a provocation." Asked about secret Swiss accounts where they have millions of dollars, Elena looks totally astonished. She says, "What accounts?" So there is a defender appointed by the court who takes the side of the prosecution quite often in this tape. I mean, it's really sort of painful feeling that it's really a bad play you're watching, and you're just about to throw up, which I'm sure many people did. And so, but it lasts for very long hours, so there's the long hours of the so-called trial. So finally, Ceausescu throughout this trial keeps glancing at his watch, which later was said that he was just waiting for secret orders a la Dick Tracy to find out who was coming to get him, But he says over and over, how long is this charade going to continue? And it's there is some kind of impatience, about this. And finally, Ceausescu, not an undignified manner, says, I am the supreme commander of the state and the leader of the party, and I'll accept only the judgment of the People's Congress. And at one point, he throws his fur hat down on the table in a gesture of frustration, as if he's putting an end to this incredibly boring and long procedure, and he's had enough, and he can't understand why he's being made to endure this. The only one who actually appears to understand that something is going on is Elena Ceausescu, who is looking at these people who, in this particular version of the tape, have no faces, and she knows them. And you can tell that she knows them. And the so-called military tribunal charges them with genocide, subversion of the state by ordering the massacre of unarmed civilians, destruction of communal property, subversion of the economy, attempt to escape from the country, having amassed and hidden more than $1 billion from foreign banks. And they're found guilty of every charge, an outcome that's met by grimaces and shaking heads in disbelief. And, there's just this sort of disturbing familiarity the whole time between the accusers and the accused. And, in spite of all of that, they seem to be speaking the same language. I mean, it's just that. And at one point, one of the prosecutors says, do you know who is holding you? And Ceausescu answers, yes, Securitate. So there's no follow-up. I mean, clearly they know each other. So at one point, Elena Ceausescu says, I was like a mother to you. Now, this was interpreted later as, being kind of a call to the nation, but she's talking directly to these people. Sentence, death and confiscation of private property. So then the accounts again begin to vary. The sentence was carried out immediately. A soldier under the command of this Major Mihai Lupoi, a rather sinister guy who spoke to Ted Koppel in January 1990, about his job. Actually, he still had this sort of unconcealed pleasure in having done this. He said Elena was worried about being tied up for shooting. She thought that her hands would break, as if it mattered if your hands are broken if you're going to die in 5 minutes. Ted Koppel, of course, loved letting this guy go on. So the soldiers were chosen, but the rest couldn't wait, and they all started firing at the same time because they all wanted to kill them. But then a later story has it that the actual people who executed them were a Colonel Virgil Magureanu, who was a philosophy professor at the Securitate Academy in Bucharest, and Gelu Voiculescu Voican, who was a geologist and amateur astrologer. At the time this book was written, Magureanu was then the head of the new Romanian Secret Services, and Voican was actually a vice minister to the Prime Minister Petre Roman, and continued in that function actually until they sort of shipped him off to some little country to disappear from sight. So the videotape of this court-martial was not shown on Romanian television actually until December 26th, which was a full day after they had been executed. And the tape wasn't released immediately, but battles were still going on. Some people who still thought they were faithful to the dictator were still shooting at people, or units of the army were shooting at units of Securitate. There was a struggle for power going on, and the reports were being delivered as whoever it was that seemed to be winning was delivering them. So watching the Romanian Revolution on television, and as you had, and as I had for a little bit on CNN, everyone was struck just by how revolutionary the Romanian Revolution looked. And the scenes were very much reminiscent of the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. You had these sort of living tableaus of people on top of tanks, and you had, the tricolor flying with a hole in it, and the armbands and the headbands. It was a beautifully photogenic I mean, it was a bloody revolution, but it was very photogenic, and it looked like it came from the history of France, actually. The French were at the time celebrating the 200th anniversary of their own revolution, so it was pictorially perfect. So only Miss Liberty wrapped in drapos was in Romania at the moment. So it was already known, of course, by the time that we saw these images, that a great deal of planning had been going on, and it had been going on for a number of years before these events took place. But, you know, I wanted to believe, as did, in fact, the entire world, that there was a kind of spectacular end to communism or to the regimes in Eastern Europe, and there was a spectacular collapse. Well, you know, it wasn't quite like that, but I did ask someone who was very much involved how they were able to make such a revolutionary-looking revolution in Bucharest. And she said the reason is that we instantly knew what to do, in that we were all educated in Marxist history, which is the history of revolutions and popular revolts. We knew from our classes that words have power. We learned how to organize a strike committee, how to use every typewriter and piece of paper to make copies to glue on walls. And we knew how to make glue out of anything for wall posters. And we knew how to organize a food detail, an infirmary, a dormitory, how to stay up all night working, how to talk to workers from factories and soldiers. They educated us. And she laughed, of course. I mean, she was a television person. She worked on television. So I had no doubt that this was true because, you know, at least knowing how to part, because I grew up and was raised in a communist school, and one of those things that they taught us how to do is how to make a revolution, or how revolutions are made. And one of the ironies of all the revolutions in East Central Europe is that they were learned in the very schools, of course, that were used to shore up to the regimes that they eventually overthrew. But, you know, quite a bit of this was a great deal of rumor. But the way it played, and this is really the subject of my talk, is that in the end, there were not 65,000 people dead in Romania, 1,000 victims total. Many of them were army and Securitate members. Some civilians were killed while these people were firing at each other. Our headlines, however, read 65,000 killed in Romania. There is a civil war going on. Our Secretary of State at the time, James Baker, said on television that he would not object to Soviet troops going into Romania to defend the revolutionaries. I mean, one thing the Romanians don't really want to hear is Soviet troops. Okay? So all that, you know, all that propaganda, all that staging, it was in fact staging, and it was a play. It was a very dramatic one with real bodies, like a Roman play, in which you need real bodies to make a play. I'm trying to shorten this account because there are a lot more ironies and things about the staging that I could tell you. But what's really amazing is that now, on the 20th anniversary in the year 2009, we still don't have the answer to the questions of who shot at whom and who the people involved in the plotting were. We don't know who fired the demonstrators in Timișoara from December 15 to 17. We don't know who fired the unarmed people everywhere in the country on December 22nd and 23rd. We don't know what the roles of the army and the Securitate were in the killings. We do know how many people died. We don't know what the National Salvation Front was, because the National Salvation Front under the same name appeared in different places in Eastern Europe at the same time. We do know who staged the coup, because Silviu Brucan did talk about it quite a bit, and he talked about the principals in the coup that had been working for a long time, who were all members of either the Securitate, the army, or the Communist Party. We still don't know anything about the Ceausescu flight and trial. Those remain mysteries, really, no matter how many. And then the most important question is, we don't know by whom the revolution was really stolen in the end. And today, of course, you have wonderfully how these things happen. And the New York Times just reported that Traian Băsescu, the current president of Romania, won re-election by a very tiny margin, because his opponent Joanna, who was part of this old machine of the Ceausescu conspirators of the coup d'etat lost by very few votes. So we're not very far. 20 years since these dramatic events that were staged for the most part for the media, a revolution that was entirely televised, we still have people in the country who actually are ready, at least half of them, to vote for the people who led the original coup. So anybody who tells you Romanians don't have a sense of drama, forget it, they do. So Romanian movies are so good. Thank you very much.
Just some correction to what you said regarding the balcony speeches. I was there by accident. Sorry.
You were where?
I was part of, I got involved in that revolution in 21st in the afternoon. And so what happened, what you said, it was happened in 22nd and 23rd. On the 21st, they managed to clean up everything. It was that barricade at the Intercontinental. Sorry. Many people died, useless, I think stupid. So my question, I have several questions for you. Who do you think was really behind the scene? So it's obvious it was a staged revolution, but
well, it was a popular revolt combined with a coup d'etat.
My personal opinion is just get out of control that popular revolt. It was a coup d'etat, which was out of control, and then they gained control back. But do you have any comments on that?
Well, it's hard to know, because Brucan, for instance, who was one of the major players in the coup, didn't get any power after. So his faction lost, whoever they were. So that's why he was willing to describe everything that happened. But who they were exactly is very hard to say. And, I mean, there are all sorts of scenarios that go from there onward, But one thing is clear. I mean, Romania is clearly not the same country. The people who did take the power very quickly left behind the ideology because it didn't serve their interests anymore. And they adopted whatever seemed expedient in order to gain not just power, but also property.
I don't want to abuse the time, but do you think, so in your opinion, who wrote that screenplay of the revolution?
Well, I think it was written in a hurry. I think that the different scenarios for the coup existed before, but once events started to move, the actual script was being improvised pretty quickly, because it depended on the situation on the ground and who was actually fighting whom. I mean, we still don't know. In Sibiu, for instance, the army and Securitate were firing at each other from across the street. And so witnesses are always talking about, these sort of victims and stray bullets running. But essentially what it was a fight between two armed units of
yeah, I totally agree with that. It was a kind of a confusion, and people were trying to fight terrorists, so nobody knows. So that's the reason they shot each other. So somebody introduced this kind of a terrorist entity which we are fighting against. And
well, the word terrorist actually probably had an origin then in 1989. That's the first time when it was very widely used on a global scale to have the word terrorists as these invisible entities that fight from everywhere.
And one more question, if I may. Do you think that people confuse the freedom of speech, of expression, of travel with a different economical system?
Oh, I really can't answer that. I don't know what they confuse, but it's clear that, there's a great deal more liberty in Romania now. People do travel, and there is a great change.
No, I'm trying to make a connection between freedom and economy. And how do you see the change in economical situation, given the fact they got some freedom? And
that's an essay question. I can thanks.
Someone else, please.
Yeah, thank you.
My question is about the helicopter putting them down out on the road. That you mentioned improvisation. This sounds like an improvisation. Can you?
Well, according to some reports, the helicopter pilot was waiting for a call from his command center, and the question was, "Do you have anybody on board?" And that meant, "Do you have the Ceausescus on board?" Because it was the presidential helicopter. And so when he said yes, then the order was to put down and kick them out. Well, I don't know. Somebody knows. I don't know.
That wasn't part of any script.
No, I think that, well, it was, I think that at that point, the decision was made to abandon them, to just get rid of them. That was it. I mean, they didn't know how they were going to do it, but at that point, they were actually in a place, in a space where it could be done, so they were just tossed out. I mean, all these people who are still alive, I mean, they're with, they spoke at length to the newspapers and so on. He didn't clarify anything in the end, but they were quite willing to be interviewed and talk about what they did.
Well, it sounds like something that wasn't planned. It was an integral part of an integrated plan to take over.
No, everything does have a feeling of improvisation, but there was a plan in place of what kind of government and organization would take the place of the dictator. Yeah.
Did this revolution benefit the people? How are people in Romania today? Do you feel it's better than?
Oh yes, definitely. It is much better. Really, it's Romania was a prison camp where people were being held hostage by an insane ideology and by a crazy dictator, and those borders came down, and whoever it is that replaced them in power got rid of the ideology, and which was a very good thing, and they started to think in economic terms instead of utopian ones, and that was really the gain of all the revolutions in Eastern Europe. So yes, of course it benefited the people, and it still does. I mean, Romania is now part of the European Union. You can barely recognize the same cities if you go now and you've been there before 1989, because then gray was the dominant color, and now you can actually see color.
Thank you very much for coming to Unarmed. It's an honor to have you, Mr. Codrescu. I just was wondering, 20 years after the revolution now, could you tell us some names of writers or people of culture that have not been tied to the old regime or with the coup that happened 20 years ago? Some people that we could look forward to read maybe someday in the New York Times or buy a book.
Well, it sounds like you probably know them better than I do. There is a young generation of writers and filmmakers, and they are telling the stories of their parents, really. I mean, the new wave of Romanian cinema, which is getting a lot of publicity now, is really fairly young filmmakers telling stories, and they are terrific. I mean, they're sort of like the Italian neorealist cinema that is coming to grips with a terrible past. And the younger writers, the ones I read in places like Noua Literatură or the magazines and publications are ultra realist and they have to be. I mean, they're like super journalists. I mean, they observe everything very closely because they don't believe in myth and fable anymore. I mean, they have a sense that reality matters, and I think that makes a lot of sense. The literature that was, considered, or the art that was considered dissident before the revolution, became historical in 1989. And of course, quite a few of those people continue to write and to produce things, and they cleave very closely to this idea that to speak of reality metaphorically, you somehow speak of the universal condition. But this is something that the young writers and artists won't buy, because they don't want any metaphors. You know? I mean, if something happens to be metaphorical, fine, but actually my impression is that they observe very closely the reality, and also they use a very fresh language, because, you know, for all the, rhetoric of the communist regime, it was a very puritanical time for writers and artists. Their language was puritanical. They really didn't talk about the realities of, the birth control policies. They didn't talk about sex. They didn't talk about, only metaphorically. But now the young artists are doing that, and of course they're being accused of being, crude and rough and so on, but they have to be. I tell you names. Of course there are names. There are a lot of names.
I think it's time. Maybe one last question.
Just a comment. I've been listening to your commentaries for many, many years on National Public Radio, and both humorous and very astounding, and privileged or happy to be able to reconcile your voice with your face.
It's just the body. I have a closet full of them.
On that note, thank you very much.